Riley is a junior graphics editor for National Geographic Magazine. He's graduated from the University of Oregon, where he's learned cartography at the UO Infographics Lab. He's going to discuss strategies for adapting maps for print magazine and viewing in the mobile browser.
Hello. Am I coming through okay? Great. First, I have to give a thanks to John for his announcing, and because at the end of lunch one day, he asked me if I was going to NACIS and doing a PCD, and I said no, and he said, do something about mobile. So that's what I'm going to do right now. All right, bear with me for a second. All right, first thing, I threw these slides on a website that I made that's on Twitter, so if you want to follow along on your computer, you can do that, but I'm going to dive right in. So, doing something about mobile. Adapting print maps for mobile use. This is kind of what it feels like sometimes. This is an image that I made that sort of embodies the feeling of trying to shove a beautiful print magazine into a mobile device, which is something that I spend a lot of time doing. So because this is my first NACIS, which I'm super excited about, just quickly wanted to tell you who I am and where I come from. I grew up in California. I studied at the University of Oregon, so shout out to Jim and Alethea and Lauren and all the ducks that are here. Did a brief stint in Sunnyvale at Apple Maps, but then thankfully landed in Washington, D.C. at National Geographic. So very happy about that. So what do? I'm a junior graphics editor for the magazine. My main duties are assisting the senior graphic editors, ensuring print standards, and also redesigning print content for digital use, and that's what I'm talking about right now. So a little definition. What do I mean by digital, and specifically what does that mean for Nat Geo when we're thinking about digital? It's a whole lot of different things, a bunch of devices that all have different sizes. And on top of all those devices, there are a ton of platforms that we have to think about. We have a tablet app, we have a mobile app, we have an owned and operated website that hosts all of our content as well as news content. Most of our stuff ends up on Twitter, it ends up on Facebook. We have an entire team dedicated just to remixing stuff into Snapchat, and now Apple News is probably the fastest growing platform that we end up putting our maps and graphics on. So at this point, you can't really ignore the fact that stuff that we put into the print magazine is going to end up in the digital space, and millions of people will probably see it. So the mobile reality that I figured out, I did some Google Analytics right before I came here. A plurality of the online Nat Geo audience views content on a mobile device. Yes, more people are going to see your map on their tiny phone opposed to their laptop, and even fewer on their tablet. So, briefly, what is our process for figuring out how we're going to prep our print assets for web use? We use AI to HTML, which I think is a pretty standard tool at this point. And in a very basic sense, it takes our Illustrator files that we use for print, we run a script, and it creates an HTML and a JPEG or whatever image format to use. And this has a ton of benefits for putting on the web. It allows for very responsive content. You get that search engine optimization, which everyone is huge on. Very lightweight assets compared to a PDF or Illustrator files. And you get pixel perfect type where your labels are concerned. But there's still a lot of human work, even though a script does a lot of that job. We're redesigning magazine content to fit 3 different device sizes. Generally, working for a desktop is pretty easy, a tablet is moderate, but mobile is often incredibly difficult, and if you think back of the Helvetica person shoving the magazine into the phone, this is what I'm talking about. So I'm going to define 3 challenges that I often run into and often have to think about when I'm redesigning for mobile. The obvious one is the physical space. I'm ignoring a lot of eyeball and resolution math, but when you get down to it and you're looking at your artboards, you're really only working with about the third of the space if you're trying to take something that was a spread map or a page map and putting it onto the phone. Another weird part of it is in a magazine you have a very finite rectangular space, but on your phone you have this weird vertical infinite void that you could technically fill. So it's a very different way of thinking. There's the resolution. On the map we're working at 300 dots per inch, and we have a 6-point map label minimum generally. On a piece of paper, you can read a lot denser, smaller labels than you can on a phone that's working at most likely 72 or 144 ppi if you got the Retina display. And we use a 13-point map label. And the final part, which is a little fuzzier, is the attention span of the audience. A National Geographic Magazine is a beautiful piece of art and journalism that people keep and treasure, some for hundreds of years. Whereas something you get on the phone might be an article that was shared by some random person that you look at for a few seconds. And I think that's worth taking into account when you're redesigning something that was in the magazine, as sad as it is sometimes. So I'm going to jump to 3 specific examples, look at 3 maps done by 3 awesome cartographers for the magazine, and then give you some lessons that I've learned working on those. So the first one is Artifact Melt. This is a magazine done in April by Matt Schwastik. So here's how it appeared in the magazine. It's a beautiful, full spread, full bleed spread of Alaska. Basically, the theme of this story is as the permafrost is melting, a lot of these artifacts that were frozen and being well preserved are now being destroyed. So there's a backdrop of a rich data set of where these artifacts are against the permafrost melting as well as native land, and it's an incredibly rich piece. And it's going to be incredibly difficult to convert from mobile, but here's what it ends up looking like. So I'm going to switch to a live look at natgeo.com, and this is, anyone can go visit it. This is how we ended up adapting it. So right away, my basic strategy for this, now that I'm confined to this little column, is to start big and go small. The biggest locator, which is this cool polar projection of where permafrost melt is occurring. Move in a little closer to Alaska, see those specific regions. And then finally, for the main map with the most of the data, we use this little drag to explore feature to try to break out of the phone a little bit. And this was crucial because of these Aleutian Islands. There's no way to fit that. I mean, putting that richness of data at this scale wasn't really going to work. So that's the kind of strategies and things we think about working with these. So jumping back over to the slides, think outside the device is lesson 1. You can use code pretty creatively and not with too much effort to use a little bit of interactivity to move outside of those size constraints. So we use a JavaScript plugin from GreenSock, which is this awesome repository of cool interactive stuff, a little HTML, a little CSS styling, and you're good to go, and you get that drag to explore. And also you have to embrace the scroll because it's the medium that your users are going to use. So here's an example of how I ended up organizing those elements vertically to try and retell the story with the same fidelity as much as possible. So second example, Scottish Moors. This is a map by Lauren James done back in May. This is a single-page map. It's of Scotland. It's of the beautiful moorland. There's a lot of debate about conserving and preserving that type of environment, even though it's not necessarily the natural environment. At the same time, there are questions about energy development and land use. So again, very complicated, very rich data layers, but luckily this time, a little bit more of an appropriate geography to show on a mobile device. So switching over again, we get an ad at the top, which again is something you're working against because you have a tiny amount of space, and there's still something, sometimes even bigger ads, that are infringing on that space. But for this one, again, integrate the locator into the title to try to give it kind of a hook graphic moving in. And for this one, I split apart the layers a little bit. So our first view of Scotland is just the moorland and some of the key regions. And then I repeat that same extent, but this time showing the wind farms and a couple of labels that are related to the wind farms. I keep the cities consistent between them, but notice how the regional physical labels only show up on the first one to make room for the windmills. And then I blew up that inset about the land ownership to the same size to give it some continuity, so you basically get 3 of the same views of Scotland with a little bit different theme. So, lessons. Reorganizing layered content. How can dense elements be split into multiple pieces is the question I asked when I was making this. I'll give you a little bit of a detail here. This is how rich, in terms of composition, the labeling was for this map. Unfortunately, not all those labels made it, but I think we were still able to preserve the main thematic layers. And you can see how that split happened between the moorland with the physical labels and then the windmills on the second version. And another thing you have to do is you have to reevaluate your label hierarchy because it's not going to be able to be preserved the same way between a print magazine and a phone. So here's an example of the way I would think about the hierarchy moving into the phone. There are some labels that have to be kept, political entities, labels that specifically apply to the story and tell the story. But then you move down a layer. What cities can you keep? Probably want to keep the capitals, but you probably won't be able to keep everything and other points of interest. And then finally, there are some labels you have to sacrifice. And when I'm working and making these kind of decisions, I think about what labels are the most critical to keep the greatest amount of context for the user as they're reading through this map. So one last example done by Lauren Tierney, who's here with us. This was in October, so very recent map. This is Nenets. The Nenets are a group of herders of reindeer in the Yamal Peninsula in very northern extreme Siberia. Again, we've got a single-page map, but also accompanied by some great charts on the left side showing development of energy resources, natural gas specifically. So last time, I'll go to Chrome and show us what we did, or show you guys what we did there. So for this one, I did a little remix on the locator. If you recall, that locator before actually specifically said where the map area is. This one, I just pointed very explicitly and bluntly, Yamal Peninsula. This is what you're looking for. This is what you're looking at. And I thought that was important because this is a pretty obscure piece of geography, especially for a US audience. So I thought it was appropriate to very explicitly point that out. And then I moved around the order of the elements a little bit and actually went into this chart next because I think it did a good job of explaining why we're talking about this place in the first place. There's this huge supply of natural gas in Russia, particularly in the Yamal Peninsula. In fact, more than there is in the United States. So that kind of gives that poignancy as you're moving into the main map. I repeated that locator again, this time specifically saying, here's the extent you're going to look at, these are the symbols that you're going to see, and then you get the main map. There were some really detailed, rich map notes on this map that unfortunately weren't going to fit, so I ended up having to do kind of a clunky fix, but number them here and then repeat below. So not the most elegant solution, but still key information that I had to keep somehow. And then as a last piece, you get that comparison of the development between 1987 and 2016, which really illustrates how much development has happened to exploit natural gas in this region. So last lessons to take away, catering to the device. How can print assets be tweaked for a little bit of relevance? This was not a hard thing to do. This took me maybe half hour and one person looked at it and said, yeah, that makes sense. But basically taking one element, adding a label and a very explicit arrow. I definitely took some inspiration from the kind of stuff you see from the Washington Post and the New York Times, where they'll give you a very explicit locator to latch onto very quickly to locate yourself. So that's the kind of tweak you can make. And then avoiding column vision. It's very easy when we're working in our design program to see the whole, to zoom out 1,000% and go, oh, here's the whole thing. I can see very simply how these elements relate to each other. But the fact is, the user, the viewer, the audience is never going to see it like you do. So I try to treat those maps more like slides in a deck, as discrete elements that people are going to see one at a time. And that's all I got for you today. Thank you.